Welcome to the show. In previous episodes this season, we've seen 7 different men try to plant a colony in so-called Spanish Florida, and all 7 fail miserably, with only the last 2 escaping with their lives. By 1560, the King of Spain wrote off Florida for colonization after Governor Visafan evacuated the failed De Luna colony. He then traveled to Santa Elena, modern-day Parris Island, South Carolina, to plant a colony, only to declare the area inhospitable to human habitation. And yet in 1562, the French traveled to that very island and built a settlement known as Charles Fort, well within the Spanish claim, in a time of peace between the two nations. Worse yet for the Spanish, this new effort from the French was led by Admiral Coligny and Commander Jean Ribault, 2 of the fiercest and most effective Navy men in the French Empire. And to add insult to injury, these men were Huguenots, or somewhere close to the French pronunciation, Huguenots, meaning these were French Calvinists, Protestants, intent on planting Protestantism into the New World, where the Spanish sought to seed Catholicism without the influence of the Lutheranos, an early Spanish term for all Protestants, derived from the name of Martin Luther, of course. Such religious concerns matter little to most of us today, but in the 16th century, the gulf between Catholicism and Protestantism was so vast, it was uncommon for an adherent of either to see the other as genuinely Christian. To the Spanish, the Huguenot colony in Florida was both a political and spiritual cantonment. In 1564, the King of Spain sends Captain Hernando de Rojas to follow up on the rumors of a secret French colony. He discovers at the mouth of a river, the St. John's River in South Carolina today, a large column of white marble. This monument claimed the riverway for the French Empire. It also gave away the vicinity of the colony. De Rojas, expecting to confront an army, instead finds a single French boy living with the nearby natives. The boy was named Guillaume Ruffi, and he was the last colonist of Charles Fort, as the rest had died, were killed, or took to the seas in a makeshift vessel, which, by the way, you can hear the entire story of French Florida from their own point of view in Season 2 of this podcast. Just a warning, it's a bit dark. Ruffi leads the Spanish to Charles Fort, and the Spanish burn it to the ground, a sign of things to come. They leave with the boy in tow, believing their Huguenot problem resolved. However, before the end of the year, a number of Frenchmen are captured, trying their hand as amateur pirates in the Caribbean. These men, poor excuses for sailors, the Spanish could not believe they found their way from the old world to the new. And under interrogation, they admitted that they were mutineers from a second, secret French Huguenot colony. Once the king is advised on the situation, he calls upon a navy man of his own, who could rival the likes of Jean Ribault. This man was Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. Born into an ancient and noble family of Asturias, his father fought in the Reconquista, freeing the Iberian Peninsula of the Moors. Returning home, he married, and Pedro Menendez, born in 1519, was just one of 20 children, and so he did not gain much of an inheritance. In 1554, Menendez commanded the ship that delivered the young Prince Felipe to England to wed Queen Mary. Now in the time of the secret French colony, the young prince was now the King of Spain, and Menendez, a trusted asset and friend. Menendez dedicates his life to ridding the Spanish Empire of pirates and fighting in the king's wars. He becomes Captain General of the Fleet of the Indies, commanding the legendary Treasure Fleet, bringing the plundered wealth of the New World back to Spain. He hands this position off to his brother, who tragically dies in 1560. Then, forced to retake the position, he commands the fleet back to Spain in 1661, losing a single ship, the recipient of much praise for this feat. Any joy was muted by the fact that that one single ship, that went unaccounted for, carried his only son. Although weary of the sea, he now desperately sought to search the western Atlantic world and the Caribbean for word of his son. But instead, he was imprisoned, and for the next 20 months, held on charges likely created to blunt his career advancement in favor of rivals. Without a sentencing or trial, Menendez, according to some of the sources, escaped prison and appeared at the king's court to secure his absolution in person. The king grants his freedom, and now tasks him with finding the second secret French colony, destroy the settlement, and execute the Lutheranos, who dared to defile his realm. Menéndez had in years past echoed the opinion of other Spaniards of the time, declaring that Florida was simply unfit for settlement, full of swamps, poor harbors, shifting sandbars, but Menéndez agreed to take on the venture, given that he would be able to search the western Atlantic world for his lost son. Menéndez was no slouch for the challenge, as he drew up a grand plan for the settlement of Spanish Florida, from the Florida Peninsula to just shy of Newfoundland, where a fortified colony would be placed on every fertile river valley to be found along the coast. Unlike the conquistadors who failed to tame Florida, Menéndez was a Navy man, and he understood the importance of a coastal empire. Of particular interest to Menéndez was the area the Spanish called Bahia de Santa Maria, which today we would call Chesapeake Bay. Years before, Giovanni di Verrazzano mapped the east coast of North America for the French Empire. Those maps had since leaked out to the rest of the European world, and he mistakenly recorded the thinning of the North American continent to a small strip of land around the area we now call the Outer Banks in North Carolina. In reality, he recorded a barrier island. He lost sight of the mainland and figured that the continent narrowed to almost nothing here, and the Chesapeake to the north could perhaps provide an inlet for a middle passage to an American version of a Mediterranean Sea, opening a waterway to the Orient, which after all European explorers wanted to find at this time. And Verrazzano's map showed just as much. For Menéndez the sailor, controlling this fabled passageway was his equivalent of a conquistador's El Dorado. But Menéndez always tempered these fantasies. He was a practical man, but he comes back to this idea time and time again. The plan as Menéndez designed it would be financed by the crown at a massive cost that the king was unwilling to spend. The king rather preferred the adelantado system accepted by past so-called governors of Florida and elsewhere in the New World Spanish Empire. Under this system, a wealthy man, mostly using his own private funds and what funds he could solicit from his network of family and allies, financed and led the invasion of a part of the New World in the name of the Spanish monarch. If successful, the Spanish Empire would grow mostly on the back of private enterprise, and in return, the adelantado would be made governor of this new area. The position would be made hereditary, and he would receive his choice of the best lands and special abilities to collect a tax for himself on customs and exports. Not ideal for Menéndez, however, but he accepts the king's proposal. But now, as governor and adelantado of Florida, he had the task of financing most of this venture himself. He pared back his plans considerably. The crown would only contribute the funds to support 300 soldiers. That's not enough to control the Florida Peninsula up to Newfoundland, is it? For now, anyway, his primary goal would be to oust the French from their hidden colony, plant 2 settlements for Spain, and convert the natives. And now both men, Menéndez for Spain and the aforementioned Jean Ribault for France, are in their respective countries rapidly gathering together soldiers, sailors, colonists, supplies, and ships intending to sail to Florida. Ribault to reinforce his secret French colony, Menéndez to destroy it. And both men were aware of one another and the activity around the busy ports preparing each fleet for their inevitable clash in the New World. It was an open secret. Menéndez leaves Spain in June of 1565 with somewhere north of 1,000 people. The estimates vary widely. Menéndez will later claim he had 1,504 people, along with 10 ships collected from friends or captured from enemies. Many of his people would be sailors. About 820 of them were likely soldiers. Whatever the truth of the numbers were, he met the threshold that the king set out for him to become governor, which was to recruit 500 people. He had already beaten that number. Jean Ribault, on the other hand, had an established colony already, and his fleet, racing Menéndez, had 12 ships and 600 additional people, many of which being soldiers. It's generally believed that Ribault had far more military men than Menéndez did on this 1565 venture. But Menéndez was up for this challenge. He had spent much of his youth fighting French pirates on the high seas. Jean Ribault, to the Spanish anyway, would be one such pirate. Ribault likewise spent his youth fighting the enemies of France, including at times the Spanish and their navy. We often use this term nemesis for any sort of rival or rivalry, but for Menendez and Ribault, either could accurately call the other their nemesis. These two men, because of their separate nations and religions, are mirror opposite images of one another. And if you've ever been in a situation involving a genuine nemesis, you will know that your behavior, energy, and courage sharpen, while your inhibitions vanish. Such will be the story of Spanish Florida versus French Florida. And so now we're racing towards the New World. And on the voyage over, one of Menendez's 10 ships becomes separated from the rest in a hurricane. It survived the storm, but was only later taken by French pirates, never making it to Florida. The rest of the ships made it to Puerto Rico. Long settled by the Spanish at this point, Menendez, with little time to spare, receives the reports created from the confessions of the French mutineers I previously mentioned, who fled their secret colony. With this information, he had a pretty good idea of where to find the riverway leading to the secret colony. He also organized his meager land forces into companies, and within this, squadrons, and placed above all of them his soon-to-be son-in-law,
Diego de Velasco.
In fact, many of the people in his chain of leadership that we will see in this episode and upcoming episodes, they're going to be friends and allies from back home, and in many cases, relatives. The most prominent of which we will see moving forward, and kind of a replacement for his son, will be his nephew, Pedro Menendez Marquez. So just keep him in mind. Outbound from Cuba, the men witnessed a comet suspended in the night sky. They took this as a sign of good fortune. However, despite the omen, Menendez reaches the area of what we would now call
St. John's Head in Jacksonville, Florida,
only to discover that the French had beaten him to Florida. He had his fleet approach the French, who are numerically superior, but engaged in offloading supplies to ferry upriver, not exactly primed for action. He calls to them and asks who they are. They yell back that they are French Huguenots. They inquire as to who he is and his people, and Menendez responds with the following.
I am Pedro Menendez, general of the fleet of the King of Spain, Don Felipe II, who have come to this country to hang and behead all Lutheranos, whom I shall find by land or sea, according to these instructions from my king, so precise that I have the power to pardon none. And these commands I shall fulfill, as you will see. At daybreak, I shall board your ships, and if I find there are any Catholics there, they will be treated well, but every heretic shall die.
At this, the French decide to make quick sail and scatter in every direction for the open sea. Menendez tries but fails to capture any of the ships of his now divided enemy, content on fleeing over fighting. Menendez, frustrated and with this chance spoiled, he decided to land as quickly as possible and make a settlement for himself. Jean Ribault, however, at the secret French colony of Fort Caroline, held council with the leaders of the colony. René Laudonnière, now Ribault's subordinate, but really the man who led the colony for most of its existence, warned Ribault about any swift naval action, as the weather in this part of the world was unpredictable, sudden, and unbelievably violent. The word we would use for such an event today would be hurricane, likely a Taino word at its origin. It seems to have only found its way outside of the Spanish-speaking world in the decade prior to our story, but it would be a long time before the word became ubiquitous. Laudonnière, as the on-the-ground leader until Ribault's recent return, has gone down in history as a failure. He has absorbed much of the blame for the problems faced at Fort Caroline and in French Florida in general. However, here, Ribault ignores his good advice. And he does this based on no knowledge of the weather of the area or the climate, but based on the reputation of Menendez, his nemesis after all, a man known for being efficient, effective, and deadly. And the last thing you want to give such an individual, if he is your nemesis, is time, because he will use every second of it at your expense. Ribault knows this, because he has the same virtues. He just sails under a different flag. And so Ribault makes the bold decision to strike out at sea with most of his boats and most of his fighting men in search of Menendez before he can dig in. Now Menendez, in great haste, after the confrontation near the St. John's River, sailed only about 30 miles down the coast until he noticed a native village. This village had a palisade around it, which would be better protection than nothing. A palisade would be a wall of sorts made out of driven logs in the ground. The Spanish land and learn that this is the Timucuan village of Saloy. Menendez's own description of the interaction between the two groups is brief and seemingly amicable. To what degree this is true is debatable. The Spanish now occupy the village. Menendez claims the land for Spain, a Catholic mass is held, and the village is renamed St.Augustine, after the patron saint of his hometown of Avilés, and the feast day for which recently passed on the very day that they first spotted Florida. So the name was fitting. After this, Menendez wasted no time. He swore in his officers and officials, he made his brother governor of St.Augustine, and began digging a defensive trench around the palisade wall of the village. But it was too late. Jean Ribault, with his warships, 200 sailors, 400 soldiers, had found them. The artillery from his ships alone could make sawdust out of the wooden palisade. The men from his own ships engaged in digging the trenches would not be able to man the ships in time to make any sort of meaningful response. Once Ribault managed to negotiate his vessels through the inlet, it was over. Ribault, on his end, knew the hazards of approaching an unknown shore, something today we don't really have to think about, but a large ocean-faring vessel can only come so close to land before hitting bottom. And in an unknown harbor, there always existed the possibility of rock outcroppings and sandbars just below the surface, nowhere near the shore. Just as Ribault began to ease his way into the inlet, a storm struck quite suddenly, perhaps a hurricane, and swept away the French completely. The Spanish moments before were preparing to fight to the death. Now they found themselves saved by what they would have considered an act of God. Between the earlier comet and now the fortunate hurricane, it seemed like the fates were in their favor. Menendez, just as Ribault would have done in his position, would not give Ribault a moment to regroup if he even could. Menendez quickly took 4 separate gambles, built on all shaky assumptions, but here they are. First, he assumed Ribault took most of his fighting men with him and away from the secret French colony. Secondly, he assumed that he and his men could make it through the swamps in the rain and march to the French colony quickly. Third, because his men had never actually discovered the French colony itself, he gambled on the word of the men of Saloy that they could reliably guide the Spanish to the colony without fault or trickery. And fourth, he assumed that he could attack the French colony and return back to his own before Ribault could regroup his people and attack the defenseless St.Augustine. But he was willing to take on all of these uncertainties. Menendez quickly gathers 500 men, and he declares the following to them.
Comrades, the time has come. We show our courage and zeal. This is God's war, and we must not flinch. It is a war with Lutherans, and we must wage it with blood and fire.
They set off overland during the storm, and in 3 days' time, they find Fort Caroline, where he catches the French completely off guard. The French fort contained only 240 people, including many women and children. Only a single sentry took post to guard the entrance. Everyone else remained indoors, weathering the storm. The idea that the Spanish somehow avoided Ribault and then marched through the swamps during the storm to take the fort was unthinkable, but that is exactly the situation the French are about to encounter. The Spaniards set about Fort Caroline, entering the dwellings and murdering the French, some of whom were still in their beds. They were all killed using lances. Some sources claim pikes, as their early firearms would not have made it through the rain in functioning order. Of the 240 people at Fort Caroline, 132, or another source says 142 people were killed. About 50 women and children were spared, and any French Catholics that could be found there, they would be taken to the new Spanish colony to supplement its meager population. Finally, they spared anyone who seemed wealthy enough to be ransomed back to their family, a common practice in that day and in previous eras. Now, of the small number of Huguenot men who were able to escape and make it back to France, 3 of them eventually wrote down their experiences in Florida. The aforementioned René Laudonnière, a carpenter named Nicolas Lachelot, and an artist named Jacques Lemoyne, whose artwork features prominently in this season so far. Lemoyne records that as he fled into the forest, he gathered together with a few other Huguenots, watching the destruction from the safety of the trees. The men quickly realized that surrendering might be their best option. One Frenchman approached the Spanish, fell to his knees, and begged for mercy. A Spaniard then ran a pike through his body. Lemoyne and the others realized surrendering was not an option. Now in the water, Jean Ribault's young son, Jacques Ribault, was in command of a few small river sloops when the Spanish attacked. He became frozen with fear, and he remained in the middle of the riverway and made no attempt to rescue his people. The Spanish, having no boats to get to him, tried to beckon him ashore, and when he refused, they began throwing the eyeballs of the dead French at him. Now Jacques Ribault is remembered throughout the ages as a coward. However, the man later regrouped with the survivors of the attack and competently led their sea voyage back to France, and that's how we get these accounts. Now back at the fort, when everything was said and done, Menéndez had the dead Huguenots thrown into a large pile and burned, while he saved a few for a formal execution. These poor souls were hanged outside of the fort, and a sign was placed nearby saying,
"I do this, not to Frenchmen, but to Lutherans."
At least according to the various versions that circulated in France. Many doubt such a sign was ever made, but it would serve Menéndez to make such a statement. After all, despite all appearances on the ground in Florida, the Spanish and French empires were not at war with one another. And so Menéndez had killed these Frenchmen under the secular pretext that Fort Caroline served as a den for pirates in Spanish territory. The religious reason, of course, being the extermination of Protestants. For Menéndez and the Spanish, it would be helpful if the French Catholic majority of France saw this massacre as part of the reoccurring Holy War against Protestants, for which France itself will have several, and for Menéndez and his interest, it would be advantageous if the people hearing about this slaughter were to be divided by religion and not nationality, in which case the French and Spanish empires were certain Catholic allies. With Fort Caroline now under his control, Menéndez renames it San Mateo, but then he quickly pivots to the issue of Jean Ribault, who may still be out there with his 600 men, or perhaps already within the palisade walls of St.Augustine. Menéndez leaves a small garrison at San Mateo and heads back to discover that St.Augustine was untouched by the French. And now the Spanish wondered, were they all lost in the storm? Were they scattered about the coast of Florida? Or did the entire fleet manage to regroup somewhere? And perhaps we're only moments away. After about a week of living with these uncertainties, Menéndez received reports from the friendly natives of Frenchmen walking about in terrible condition, heading back towards what they believed to be Fort Caroline. Menéndez rushes out to confront the group, finding to his seemingly unending luck that this was just a small fraction of Ribault's 600. And indeed, however more might be out there, the surviving French were cast upon the coast of Florida a few at a time, and they had yet to unite. The first group of Frenchmen, when confronted by the Spanish, asked for terms of their surrender. Menéndez gave them no guarantee of safety other than that they would be allowed to surrender. The French had little choice. One by one, the French were taken in a boat with their hands bound, taken out of view, and then knifed. Menéndez only saved the Catholics among them, and anyone else who seemed useful for his new colony, such as musicians, oddly enough. And then, about a week later, a larger group of Frenchmen are spotted in the same area as the first. This would be the bulk of the French who survived the storm. Menéndez, as he approached, saw a Frenchman call out to him for terms of surrender. It was Jean Ribault himself. The account Menéndez leaves claims that he gave the same terms as the first group, merely the ability to surrender and accept one's fate. The French accounts, reportedly sourced from survivors, claims Menéndez gave a number of assurances for their safety. In either case, about half of the French flee from the Spanish, while the other half, led by Ribault, surrendered. This group was executed in the same manner as the first. Menéndez put 130 Huguenots to the knife. He spared 10 Catholics and 6 boys. Ribault did not escape the fate of his fellow believers. Often high-ranking officers were spared out of respect or to be ransomed. But in this case, Menéndez simply had too much respect for Ribault to allow him to live. In his own words, he wrote of Ribault, after the fact, that
the King of France could do more with him and 50,000 ducats than with others and 10 times 50,000.
They named the riverway next to the dead Frenchmen the Matanzas, meaning the slaughter, a name it still bears today in the state of Florida. Ribault's head was cut off, quartered, and each piece was planted on a pike for public display on the four ends of the settlement of St.Augustine. While a number of the French were still out there, they would soon be hunted down. French Florida was no more. And after so many failures, Spanish Florida had its first permanent settlement. St. Augustine is today perhaps better known as St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest surviving European settlement in the continental United States. And this is the true legacy of French Florida, that after having written off Florida as inhospitable, the Spanish Empire only regained interest in occupying it to keep the French out of possessing it. Moving on. In November of 1565, Menéndez finds a group of Frenchmen making a crude fort at the future site of Cape Canaveral. He sends a French trumpeter to secure their surrender, this time in return for a guarantee of their safety. About 75 men surrender, and then their fort is burned to the ground. Without his nemesis, Menéndez had softened a bit. It is after this spectacle that Menéndez first draws the attention of the local Ayas people. Menéndez provides gifts to the Ayas people. One of the most popular things to be given away by Europeans to new groups that they came across were mirrors. Can you imagine never having seen yourself in a mirror your entire life and then suddenly being able to? It was quite a thing to receive, and it certainly got people's attention. Now, through interpreters, he secured their allegiance to the King of Spain. Most certainly, the Ayas people came away with a different interpretation of what they were agreeing to or what was being discussed. Menéndez, in a letter, gave his first impression of the natives of Florida to the king, where he calls them a noble race. Menéndez then settles a number of his people among the Ayas people and leaves Florida for Cuba with 50 men and 20 French prisoners to obtain resupply, especially food, for which the Spanish settlers of Florida were sorely lacking, both in supply and the skills involved in both farming or fishing. In Cuba, the local governor repeatedly blocked any effort Menéndez undertook to obtain food, seeing his Florida effort as a drain on Cuban resources. Menéndez would have to acquire much of what he sought by sending boats to New Spain. While in Cuba, Menéndez learns that the king intends to send 1,800 soldiers to Florida. These would become more hungry mouths to feed, and Menéndez himself sends out for a native called by the Spanish Don Luis, who the Spanish kidnapped off the coast of the Chesapeake. Menéndez clearly still intended to stretch his Florida settlements to the fabled Middle Sea of Verrazano, and perhaps even further north, as far as Newfoundland. As I mentioned before, Menéndez had secured the right to sell fishing licenses to generate some revenue for himself and his colony. The areas near Newfoundland in the North Atlantic are some of the best cod fisheries in the world. And certainly money was on his mind. Menéndez, as successful as he had been in the last 3 months, now had 3 settlements that produced 0 exports, nor could they even support themselves. Already close to exhausting his own wealth and those of his associates and his family, he is the first man to face the persistent problem in the history of Spanish Florida, which is how to make Spanish Florida just self-sustaining, let alone relevant or a resource to the Spanish Empire. And so it is here that we close the first chapter in the story of Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. In about 3 months' time, Menéndez destroyed French Florida, and now with St. Augustine, San Mateo, and his people in Ayas country, he could boast that he had 3 settlements. This Navy man, an only reluctant colonizer, accomplished more in a single season of a single year than all 7 or so of the former governors of Florida combined. And perhaps with one exception of having 200 married couples in the colony, Menéndez had fulfilled all the requirements the king put upon him to secure his position as adelantado, and then some. The real tragedy of history is that Pedro Menéndez is not a household name, whereas his failed predecessors, like Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto, are. I digress. Setting the stage for our next chapter, in Cuba, Menéndez received word of a Calusa chief on the southwestern side of the Florida Peninsula, who sent his warriors about the shore, capturing shipwrecked Spanish sailors and taking the remaining cargo of their ships. Being ships from the Spanish treasure fleet, this meant a great deal of silver and gold. And just to remind the listener, Menéndez still longed for information concerning his lost son. If this did not create enough urgency, this chief kept the Spanish as slaves, and he would, on occasion, sacrifice one to a deity that the Spanish referred to as the devil. The chief shed his own name after learning from the captives of the King of Spain, and so he went by the name Carlos, to make it very clear to the Spanish captives who was in charge of this country. The chief shed his own name after learning the name of the King of Spain, and so went by the name Carlos, to make it very clear to his Spanish captives who was in charge in the land of the Calusa. In our next episode, Menéndez will race to the country of Carlos. We will learn the fate of his son, and the natives will rise up against the Spanish at all of his settlements. Not to mention, the French will be coming back for vengeance. Stay tuned till next time. I'm Eric Yanis. This has been another episode of the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.